In this segment, this is our third and last segment of our Global Flood and Hydroplate Theory seminar. We will look at Walt Brown's primary competition today. But first, Walt earned his mechanical engineering PhD from MIT. So that is an extraordinary accomplishment just to get a PhD from MIT. He was serving as an Army Ranger. Note the sleeve insignia, the Army Ranger lightning bolt. The leaf is gold, which signifies the rank of major. So in this photo, he was still Major Brown, not yet a full colonel. When we said earlier, try to Google this, and we saw how popular hydroplate theory was compared to catastrophic plate tectonics. Well, when Henry Morris mentioned Walt Brown among a few national ministries, it really is because of the impact and the influence that he's had is equivalent to a national ministry. I'll give you some examples by doing some Google searches to check out rankings. So this is rankings. If you Google, in quotes, Origin of the Grand Canyon, Walt is number 3 out of 700,000 web pages, and that's been consistent for a long time. So, it's hard to beat like Wikipedia or something like that, but 3 out of 700,000 web pages. Oh, and CMI, which is one of the major groups, and I love them, they're number 6. So those are the highest 2 creation sites. Origin of radioactivity. Now, I didn't put that in quotes because Walt's theory is the origin of Earth's radioactivity, but it also applies to radioactivity generally. And if you Google origin of radioactivity, Walt is number 1 out of over 3 million pages. If you add in origin of Earth's radioactivity, which is Walt's part of the hydroplate theory, very few people ask the question, how did radioactivity start on Earth? Because the atheists all assume that it came from supernovas billions of years ago. So they say, what is the origin of radioactivity? It's supernovas, heavy elements. But they don't say, what's the origin on Earth? Because they think the Earth came from stars exploding. Creationists have not addressed the question of why is there radioactivity on Earth when there should be none based on how God made the Earth, because when heavy elements decay, they shoot out like bullets. And those things, if there is a chunk of, let's say, coal in a potbelly stove in somebody's home, and there's a little bit of uranium in there, which there is, but very little, but it happens to have an atom that is decaying, that will go right in through somebody's body, and if it hits a chromosome in a woman's ovaries, and then if she ovulates and that becomes her baby, fertilized, then the baby will have a birth defect or die. So when God made the Earth, there would not have been uranium on the Earth. No uranium, no thorium, no polonium. None of the heavy elements that are radioactive and unstable, there was none. Walt's theory addresses that, and it's brand new in the realm of science, in the realm of thinking Christian human beings, in the realm of creationists. No one has proposed how do radioactive elements appear on an Earth that was originally created by God as a paradise. In the DVD version of this, we can include the fabulous video by Brian Nickel, who's a mechanical engineer in the aerospace industry. He has offered very generously that we can include those videos in the DVD. Okay, also origin of limestone, very important issue. That stuff was all eroded from the subterranean chambers. Not all, but the vast majority. And the same is true of the sedimentary layers on the Earth. Walt is number 1 out of 44,000. ICR is number 3. Origin of comets. Walt is number 3 of 151,000 pages. AIG is number 4. And then I got the hydroplate logo flashing because it's all excited. Because if you Google Fountains of the Great Deep, number 2 of 500,000 pages. Number 2. And the image on the top right is number 1. The reason Walt's number 2 is because the image is number 1. So it's really, really exciting. What about catastrophic plate tectonics? That's today's alternative among professional creationists. We're going to begin with a warning from Henry Morris. He wrote this in his book, The Genesis Record, and this warning is not heeded. There's two warnings in this quote. It'll be the longest quote I read in the seminar, and he warns about two things, and CPT violates both, at least the current version of it, proposed by the lead author. Henry Morris, page 196, he wrote this in 1976. The Bible specifically attributes the flood to the bursting of the fountains of the great deep and the pouring down of torrential rains from heaven. These two phenomena are sufficient in themselves to explain the flood and all its effects without the necessity of resorting either to supernatural creative miracles or to providentially ordered extraterrestrial interferences of speculative nature. Like, let's say somebody said comets crashed into the earth and brought all the water. That would be extraterrestrial interference, for example. The breaking up, literally the Bible says the cleaving open of the fountains of the great deep is mentioned first, and so evidently was the initial action which triggered the rest. These conduits somehow all developed uncontrollable fractures on the same day. Wow. There must have been a worldwide cause. The most likely cause would seem to have been a rapid buildup and surge of intense pressure throughout the underground system. Now, in our video overviews, Walt Brown mentioned tidal pumping, how the gravity of the moon is basically by lifting the crust about 9 inches every day as it does today, and then that crust falling back down with the weight of the crust of the earth, it is compressing the pillars. The earth is 200,000 miles around the surface of the earth, 200,000 square miles about, and there would have been millions of pillars, and every day those pillars are compressing and being pulled up and compressed, pulled up and compressed. That transfers energy into those pillars, which eventually become hot enough to superheat the subterranean chambers. Where does that energy come from for those who are physics oriented? It comes from the angular momentum of the Earth's rotation. So you don't violate the second law, you don't get free energy for nothing. So the subterranean chambers, eventually the pressure and temperature build throughout the underground system until the entire system ruptures worldwide. That's what Henry Morris wrote here, which is uncanny insight. But he could read the Bible, which he did. And he was a PhD in hydraulics. He ran the hydraulics department at Virginia Tech. So he was a sharp scientist. His warning about miracles and extraterrestrial interference, we're going to see that the CPT didn't pay heed to that. Michael Ord is a meteorologist, young earth creationist. He's a dear Christian man. I've spoke to him recently. He and I just agreed we'll do an interview on one of his recent articles. He has a flood impact model, which I think is wrong. He believes that meteors crash into the earth and that released water from the crust. He thinks that's how the flood was initiated. I love him as a brother, respect him, enjoy him, but I think he's wrong. So his model would violate that warning from Henry Morris, don't call upon extraterrestrial intervention, because the Bible doesn't say that. It's sort of ad hoc. So from Michael's perspective, there's a book called The Flood Science Review. It's 1,600 pages long. Michael proposed his flood impact model there, and 10 scientists challenge each of the models. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, catastrophic plate tectonics, vapor canopy, and so on. Before you present your model, each author had to present the biblical material that uniquely supports your model. How does the Bible say that your model is true? Walt Brown's section in that book is pretty long. I think it's the longest. Michael Lord, here's a quote. He wrote a little bit, but this sums it up on page 1370. There is very little information on the events that initiated the flood in the Bible. Wow. We spent an hour and a half going through what God said about where the waters of the great deep were from, how they were made, and so on. We'll see a little bit more of that at the end of this session. The reason Michael looks at the Bible, he loves the Lord, he knows God's word is true, but he wants to see a flood impact model starting the flood. Meteors crashing into the earth. You don't see that. So from that perspective, the Bible doesn't say much. We made this chart, and we're going to share this online at rsr.org/hydroplate. And this is a chart of biblical material that uniquely supports which flood model? Remember, rakia means the earth, the crust of the earth, the plate of the earth, and the sky. It means both. But some people say, no, it only means the sky. It never means under your feet. It only means the sky. Let's assume for this chart that they're right. If they are right, here's my best assessment. And we're going to put this online so people could add to it, put comments. It's already online. We'll add the link. Here's my best assessment, that the vapor canopy theory gets 3 hits, so to speak. Where God called the firmament heaven, then they're right. I mean, by definition, right? If rakia refers only to the space, then you can't count that for the hydroplate theory, and that's a point for them. The rakia divided the waters under it from the waters above it. So if the rakia only means the atmosphere, then there's like the sea on the crust of the earth, and then there's the vapor canopy above. That would be a point for them. And then finally, the windows of heaven were opened. That sort of fits really nicely with the vapor canopy theory. Then there's still, even if rakia only meant what's above our heads, there's still verses that strongly argue for the hydroplate theory, like where the Bible says that earth was founded upon the seas and established upon the waters. Well, forget about where the rakia is. The earth is on top of the seas, on top of the waters. That means there's water under the earth. So that verse would have to still go for the hydroplate theory. And I'm not going to read all these because we went through them already. But what if rakia did also refer to the crust of the earth? What if that's the case? Then how does the biblical material sort itself out? The vapor canopy theory loses a bit, and here's what we have for the hydroplate theory. And we have gone through these verses, and we have seen that they are specifically describing a structure of the creation and the events of the flood that affirm in a very unique way that the floodwaters came from under the crust of the earth, under the rakia. And so the vapor canopy theory, we still give them that. The windows of heaven were opened. But, as Henry Morris said, when the fountains of the great deep broke forth, that is the event that caused all the other events. So the water comes up, and then gravity, it falls back down as rain for 40 days. If the major source of the floodwaters was from the vapor canopy theory, well then after 40 days the rain stopped. Why did the waters continue to rise for another 110 days? The vapor canopy's out of water. It only had 4 inches anyway. So that check mark there, that's crazy generous. All right, so this comes from Walt's book, The Hydroplate Theory, Key Assumptions. And his main assumption is that there was subterranean water. About half of the water now in the oceans was once under the crust. I think scientifically speaking, he's right to call that an assumption. But how about biblically speaking? Biblically speaking, it's a given. From everything the Bible says, there was subterranean water, and it did flood the earth. And God divided the waters below from the waters above. So this is an assumption, and I think Walt is honorable as a scientist to list it as his primary assumption. There are a couple other assumptions relatively minor. This is the big one. And if your big assumption is a given because God told you, then that really improves the credibility of your model. And these are the verses that explicitly, that we've gone through, show that Walt's assumption is a given. Okay, catastrophic plate tectonics. And I have the word miracles with it because its mechanisms are based on miracles, as we'll see. We'll quote the lead author, who's a geophysicist from Los Alamos National Labs, and a man I've interacted with over the years. And I do love him dearly. Talked to him a few times, a number of times this year, met him in person this year. They based their model on miracles. This is the model promoted by all the big creation groups for the most part. This is their model. And there's another part of it. It has to do with radioactive decay. You know how atheists and evolutionists look at radioactive elements in the earth and they'll say, well, this uranium decayed to thorium, this decayed to this. So they say, so we know it's been here billions of years. Well, creationists have powerful evidence to refute that claim. And John Baumgartner and these other scientists with ICR and CRS and AIG and CMI, they have done a fabulous job showing that that whole story by the atheist is not true. But they don't know why the radioactive elements are there. They don't know. The reason they don't know is because we had to discover what made them. And I'll try to say it in 3 sentences. It'll be impossible. But when lightning strikes, lightning causes atoms to lose their electrons, and they're squeezed together with such tremendous force, it's called the Z-pinch, that it creates heavy elements. And those heavy elements, they decay within days and weeks, and they're gone. And this is known. When earthquakes happen, there are lightning strikes underground that are the equivalent of a magnitude 7 earthquake, creates about 1 million volts of electricity in a couple seconds. A magnitude 7 earthquake. So lightning causes heavy elements, which is like radioactive elements. When earthquakes happen, there are lightning strikes in the ground, which is well documented. Current research continues, very well documented. So during the global flood, there was more pressure on the granite in the crust than ever since. And so our magnitude 7 earthquake today is nothing compared to the continents being compressed and mountains raising up. There was tremendous force at work on the granite. Granite is made of quartz. This is my 4th complex sentence. Granite is made of quartz, and when you compress quartz or you pull on it, it produces a positive or negative voltage, and that's why all the radioactive elements on the earth, I say all, the vast majority, are in the crust of the continents. It's not under the oceans, it's not in the mantle, it's not in the core. 90% of Earth's radioactivity is in the continental crust. Walt Brown has discovered, not because he's the most brilliant person who ever lived, he might be up there with Isaac Newton, but it's because he had an insight. The insight is the Bible's right when it says that the flood was caused from the fountains of the great deep. They came up from under the rakia. That's it. With that insight, the rest begins to fall into place after a lot of hard work. So let's go to catastrophic plate tectonics and the accelerated radioactive decay. They call that project the RAPE project. The fact that they claim a lot of miracles, well, there are 343 miracles in the Bible, and I know because I counted them one time. There's a lot of miracles. This chart shows how they're distributed, and that comes from my life's work. It's called The Plot, an overview of the Bible. It's my labor of love, and it's on page 228. You know, there, God does a lot of miracles. We know that. But we can appeal to miracles implied in the Bible, but if we have physics problems in our flood models, we should not appeal to miracles that the Bible does not imply. Because if you do, then anybody's idea is equally valid. What's the difference, really? It's just Oh, well, this evidence doesn't support your model. Well, at that point, God did a miracle. Oh, but then this evidence doesn't support it. Well, that was another miracle. Well, how about this evidence? That was another miracle. Well, how do you refute that? People have called me on the air and said, Bob, God told me. I said, wait, if God told you, you should be doing the show, not me. I don't want to do the show. You do the show. Whatever you say, I have to believe it, right? I can't question it because God told you. They'll say, oh, no. Well, then why do you say God told you? So if we're going to say, well, God did it, how do you argue with that? So these are the groups that support catastrophic plate tectonics and its miracles. And these are the scientists who do, and many others, Baumgartner, Austin, Snelling, Humphreys. Humphreys, he's a cosmologist. He and I have decided we'd be doing a show on the Earth's magnetic field and the magnetic fields of the planets that is just shrinking at rapid rates. So here's what John Baumgartner, he's the lead author of CPT. He wrote in CRSQ, which is the Creation Research Society Quarterly. We have one of these left. This is the one I was so thrilled. They published this year my article on Dobzhansky, an evolutionist, who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So I got to do a 40-year look back at his claim, and that was really fun. John Baumgartner wrote this: the physical laws were somehow altered by God to cause the flood catastrophe to unfold. So he's saying there must have been a miracle. Here's his miracle. Miracle number one: edges of the supercontinent get 700 degrees colder. Now, a lot of people have heard plate tectonics promoted for years, a lot of creationists, but they don't really know how it works because it's not bragged about very often. But here's the model. You had an original supercontinent, and plate tectonics say that these plates move the speed your fingernail grows, about an inch a year. But they need them to move fast. So to speed it up 1,000,000 times, they say that the edges of the supercontinent, the temperature plunged in a day to about near absolute zero. And that plunge, so it was a little warmer under the surface to start with, but it plunged 700 degrees. That made the rock more dense, and therefore it would sink into the mantle. Okay, more dense rock sink into the mantle. Well, there's a problem with that because when you run the physics and do the animation, the edges of the supercontinent get that cold, and they're that dense, and they're not going to sink into the mantle. They're just going to sit there, just very cold. So I wanted to establish each of these. So this is from 2002. In the Journal of Creation, Dr. Baumgartner wrote, an initial temperature perturbation is required. That means it got colder, right? We're not scientists, he is. An initial temperature perturbation is required to initiate motions within the spherical shell domain that represents the Earth's mantle. For this, a temperature perturbation of minus 400 degrees Kelvin to a depth of a few hundred kilometers is introduced around most of the perimeter of the supercontinent. So that is one of our leading creation scientists saying, here's how I believe the flood happened, the flood we read about in the Bible. The edges of the supercontinent got really cold. That's very ad hoc. That's just inventing ideas. Miracle number two, the Earth's mantle gets mushier. Because it gets real cold and nothing happens. So it's colder and denser, but if the mantle is mushier, the viscosity changes, the edges will start to sink. But maybe they were mushy to begin with, and after the flood they got firmer. Either way, it's a miracle. And that's from 1990, Proceedings of the Second International Creation Conference. The mantle's viscosity at the time of the flood was lower than at present to permit rapid sinking of the lithosphere into the mantle. Now we have miracle number three. God removed the heat of accelerated radioactive decay. So they see all these radioactive elements in the crust. They know the Earth is young, so they say somehow the radioactivity sped up, but how? They admit they have no idea. Why is there radioactivity in the crust? No idea. Would God have created radioactivity in the crust? Not likely. It was a paradise. There'd be no birth defects. But they say if there were all these radioactive elements, there were not before the flood, but if there were, and they decayed rapidly, billions of years worth of decay rapidly, where atoms are shooting out particles, and those atoms become different elements then, and that they might shoot out more. Every time that happens, it produces heat. And all that heat, if it happened during the flood, it would melt the crust of the earth, or nobody could survive. So they say they have a heat problem, and they very much openly say that God solved the heat problem. Now, many of these scientists will say Walt Brown's theory can't be right because it has a heat problem. Well, how can you claim miracles for your own heat problem and then deny them to anyone else? That's not fair. It's special pleading. So here is the rate project published by ICR, 2005, The Heat Problem. God was directly involved in all of these events, so it is possible that he employed some supernatural process which does not occur today or cannot be detected. That's a miracle to remove the heat. That is also said by Don DeYoung. He's the president of CRS, publishes that journal I just showed you. He spoke at our church last summer at Denver Bible Church, the church that I pastor. He and his wife were there. We had a wonderful time with him. But he wrote this in his book, Thousands, Not Billions. Most biblical miracles require a temporary suspension of basic natural laws. Heat dissipation, that's the subtitle. Because the crust of the earth did not melt during the flood period, it is proposed that an enormous expansion of space, 20-fold times or greater, occurred during the flood event. Now, some of the rate team scientists have proposed this. Russell Humphreys has written this up as a serious proposal. Don DeYoung should say that was proposed, but it's not reasonable. It's not reasonable for us as creationists to say, well, our model has a heat problem, so the size of the universe expanded by 20 times in order to take the heat out of our floodwaters. That's not a reasonable, it's not a defensible, it's not justifiable. It's ad hoc, it's a rescue device. The Bible doesn't imply it. If it did happen, it would remove the heat where the earth was too hot. And where the earth wasn't too hot, like on the ark, it would freeze it to death. You wouldn't just expand the universe. You'd have to tweak that heat loss at every point on the earth. There's Don's book, Thousands, Not Billions. A great book. I was involved in their Thousands, Not Billions conference in Denver some years ago, just in promoting it and going to it. It was just great. So some disagreements, but overall, these guys, they love the Lord and they point people toward a young earth, a global flood, and God is our creator. So we're all on the same team. This is the photo from earlier. These are the scientists who are part of the rate project. And like I said, for the most part, they either will strongly oppose the hydroplate theory or, to the best of my knowledge, just disagree with Walt and certainly not endorse the hydroplate theory, but they'll endorse CPT and the rate project. So, miracle number 4, extraterrestrial intervention to transport sediments. Now remember what we said earlier? However the flood actually happened, it has to erode enough rock that it could be deposited on the continents 1 mile deep. Imagine a mile deep of sand and rock and debris to cover just Indianapolis, 1 mile high. Then start going to Martinsville and just start spreading out. Get out to Warsaw. Think of how much rock that is. Go to Colorado. Cover the North American continent. Cover all the continents 1 mile high. That's a lot of rock. If you are eroding that rock because it's raining from a canopy theory, well, real quickly you're not going to be able to erode anymore because all that sediment is going to fall back down. And so you'll just be stirring up the bottom. Maybe at the bottom of let's say the floodwaters, there's a quarter-mile thick of sediments. Let's say vapor canopy was right, and by some miraculous way, it eroded a quarter-mile of sediments, which is inconceivable, but say it did. Well, how are you going to erode the next 3/4 miles of sediment? You can't do it. If you eroded a half-mile deep of rock into grains of sand, enough to cover all the continents, then all that would have to be suspended in the floodwaters, circulating through the earth while you're eroding the next half-mile. It's not possible. So they need miracles, the equivalent of miracles, to erode the sediments. Now, ask yourself, is that reasonable? For God to judge the earth, did he need to erode a certain amount of sediment, or did he need to drown mankind? The floodwaters killed everything that has breath in its nostrils on the face of the earth. So all mankind, except for Noah, his wife, and their 3 sons and daughter-in-laws, everyone was killed. Did it matter if we had a 1/4 mile of sediments, or a mile of sediments, or 5/8 a mile? It didn't matter. So why would God need to do miracles just to erode sediments? Because your flood model can't explain where the erosion came from. So if CPT can't explain it, the vapor canopy theory has no way of explaining it. And once you erode it, you have to deposit it. And that takes tremendous turbulent flow, tremendous energy. So where does all that energy come from? With Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, it comes from gravity, which is the first actor pushing down on the subterranean chamber and forcing the water up with tremendous force. But as that's happening, the lightning in the crust, the granite crust of the earth, is producing a sea of neutrons, radioactive elements, and the earth has become basically like a nuclear engine, the subterranean chamber, producing tremendous energy. And then the supercritical water, once water gets a certain pressure and temperature, it no longer behaves like a liquid. It doesn't behave like a gas. It behaves like something else. And it is shocking, the things that it's able to do regarding temperature and erosion. And this is well documented. It's used in industry. So the hydroplate theory is just a recipe for how you erode all the sediments on the earth. It's obvious. They came from the subterranean chamber, and when the water was coming up, they ruptured 10 miles high with cliffs on each side eroding away. So the erosion didn't come from the surface of the earth. You can't do it. You can't erode that much from the surface. So John Baumgartner proposed this. He did this summer in Pittsburgh at the 7th International Conference on Creationism, one of the greatest events I ever have gone to in my life. I was there at John's presentation. I've read his paper. So he acknowledged using the software. Now, he is one of the world's better-known geophysicists. He is a scientist who's worked at one of our national labs, Los Alamos, for many years. He created a software program called Terra for being able to study the interior of the earth, even though we can't get down there. And that's used by geologists around the world. He's brilliant, and he's a Christian who loves the Lord. So using his software, he said, catastrophic plate tectonics can't erode all that sediment, and it can't carry it and deposit it. So it has to be something else. So he checked to see, what if there were meteorite impacts? Could that do it? And he said, when you look at the earth, and it can't do it. We can't call on meteorite impacts. How about earthquakes creating tsunamis? He said, no, that doesn't do it. What if the poles flipped? What if that happened? Doesn't do it. We can't get that water turbulent enough to erode a mile deep of sediments and then transport them. We can't do it. So he wrote this paper, and he said, here's how we can do it. It is proposed that 6 near encounters with a moon-sized body, this moon-like body in outer space, the Earth's gravity caught it, it went around the Earth 6 times, and then it flew away. And that's where you can get the energy to erode all the rock and then transport it. And I think on its face that is utterly unreasonable. With all the other miracles, now we have this moon thing. So he says the tide that would be caused would be 2,500 meters high. That's a 1.5 mile high tide. That's pretty serious. Presumably an interaction with some other body caused it subsequently to break free of the earth. Plate tectonics model is in meltdown. It is not a valid biblical model for how the global flood happened. It's not a valid scientific model. It's somebody, like the vapor canopy theory. We took a secular idea, tried to fit it in the Bible. And it caused decades of lost opportunity by Christians who really couldn't answer the hard questions of people asking. So we have, for today, for you guys, we created an animation of this process of the Earth capturing this moon. And our point in showing this is to drive it home the rescue device needed to support answers in Genesis, catastrophic plate tectonics. This is what's needed based on their lead author. Now, John Baumgartner doesn't work for AIG, but AIG promotes catastrophic plate tectonics. All the big groups do. So we want to drive home the seriousness of their inability even just to erode the rocks during the flood. Catastrophic plate tectonics, erosion, and deposition problems are this serious. Just to erode flood sediments, an extraterrestrial intervention. Different cycles create close encounters between the object and the moon, as we'll see. Here comes the first near miss. The bigger point, though, is the admission that catastrophic plate tectonics cannot erode the world's flood sediments. Second near miss. The creation movement, AIG, ICR, CRS, CMI, didn't realize what it was getting into. We can see the wisdom of Henry Morris in the Genesis record, warning creationists, do not resort to miracles of convenience, nor extraterrestrial events, because the Bible attributes the flood to the breaking forth of the fountains of the great deep. These 6 orbits illustrate how far people will go to defend an idea that is evidently false. By forcing evolutionary geology into Genesis, creationists have created many problems and have whitewashed the errors of plate tectonics. And thank you, Neil Copley, for that music. That's a commitment to a model. That's what that is, right? And we human beings, when you write a short story and you ask people to read it, and they say, well, did you ever think of changing this part here? And they're like, what are you talking about? That's my baby. You want to cut off his ears? You can't change my short story. So when you have scientists who've studied for years plate tectonics, and then they take it and they propose, this is how the global flood happened. It's plate tectonics sped up 1 million times. And then the more they study it, they see, well, it doesn't work here, so we need a miracle. And then it doesn't work here, we need a miracle. It doesn't work here, we need a miracle. Now, here, oh boy, it's weird to say God did a miracle and he eroded all the rock. So you have an extraterrestrial intervention. rescue device. So we think that it's time to put to rest the catastrophic plate tectonics theory.
Like IE6.
They really did. Casket. Microsoft sent flowers. It was a tech firm in Denver. It's time for CPT to be put to rest. It is taken resources from the creation movement that could have been used to better understand the Bible and the world that we live in and to answer people's questions. And that is lost opportunity. Economists call that the opportunity cost. How much closer could we have been if we had not gone down the wrong path of vapor canopy and the wrong path of CPT? At the conference in Pittsburgh, I asked Dr. Baumgartner a question. He responded. He's just so gracious to me. He was on the kids' radio drama program called Jonathan Park Adventure Series. And one of the episodes, our kids have listened to all the Jonathan Park series. They're so great. They teach kids about creation and how to expose the misinformation from the evolutionists and the atheists. And they're so entertaining. On one episode, they needed a real scientist to help the kids, Jonathan Park and his friends. They were invited to a radio show. So they said, well, could we bring a scientist with us in the program? The drama, radio drama, they said, well, sure, you could bring a scientist. So they're like, well, we're going to get John Baumgartner to join us. And so John played himself on this episode, which is so great. But here I was able to ask him about this. And at the ICC, I don't know how many people were there, hundreds of people, scientists from around the world. It's not a pro-Walt Brown forum. It's CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics, and then there's some Walt Brown rebels like me walking around trying to figure out, what trouble we could cause. And so in the Q&A, John had just presented some body orbited the Earth 6 times. So I went up in the Q&A and asked him a question.
Bob Inyart, Real Science Radio. Dr. Baumgartner, a question about mechanisms. So if we have planetary body or bodies with near misses, it seems you've put the ICC on the horns of a dilemma where either we have Velikovsky or Walt Brown, because I'd like to ask you if you considered in your mechanisms, if a subterranean chamber collapsed about a mile deep and the continents then fell, then a possible mechanism could be the gravity that causes that water to begin flowing because of the continents crushing the subterranean chamber. I wondered if you considered gravity as a mechanism. Thank you.
Okay. As I pointed out in a few places, that problem of the hypothesis of these subterranean chambers of water, even though there's scriptures that one can well suspect might be pointing that direction, I find it very difficult to imagine how those could be sustained for very long. If basaltic magma can find its way out easily today, then water that has even lower density than basaltic magma almost certainly could find its way through cracks, even from just the daily tidal motions, to escape. That kind of a configuration is very unstable. I personally think that's not a trivial objection, a trivial problem. I believe it's a serious problem for Walt Brown's hypothesis.
Dr. Baumgartner, he answered my question without answering it. I said, did you consider gravity? Did you model that? If the continents did crush a subterranean chamber, what kind of energy, how turbulent would the water become? We have a little earthquake and a tsunami that kills 100,000 people. Well, what if instead of a little earthquake, what if North America fell 3/4 of a mile down toward the mantle? How much energy would that release on the crust of the Earth? Quite a bit. And that's only part of the energy of the hydroplate theory. And so he didn't model that, and that wasn't a surprise. But then he gave his favorite objection to Walt's theory. He said, if you have water 10 miles beneath the crust, that water is going to find its way into cracks, and it's going to come up, crust will fracture, and you'll have the flood like on day one, or on the first year after God made the earth, it's going to escape. It'd be unstable. And he said, today, magma finds its way up through cracks. Well, today, the crust of the earth is all fractured. There's cracks everywhere. When God made the earth, he would have made it perfectly. The moon would not have been all beat up like it is. The moon is beat up mostly on the near side because of the debris that was ejected from the earth. When God made the earth as rock, as you go deep below the surface, the pressures become so intense that a term plasticity, rock begins to flow like putty. And the pressures are so great, if you think about it, when you're 10 miles below the crust, you have the weight on top of you pushing down. You have what's below wanting to go up, if it could. And you have, because of gravity, the rest of the sphere of the earth around you is pushing in on you. The pressure is enormous. A crack is not able to open up at those pressures. A microscopic crack would have to open up for then water to come out of that subterranean chamber and begin to break through the crust. What God did when he made the subterranean chamber is he created this hydraulic system which was brilliant, and he fine-tuned it in such a way that it functioned perfectly the way we see fine-tuning in every other aspect of what God made. The fine-tuning of the physical constants of the universe stun the atheist. They are stunned by it. And how is everything so perfect? If you study the water cycle, young kids in school, homeschool, they study the water cycle. Scientists have written entire books on the brilliance and the uncanny perfection of the balancing of all the constants in the physical forces that are necessary for us to have a water cycle. Who would have thought it, right? It evaporates, comes down. And so for God to be able to build the earth with waters under the crust that are waiting there in storehouses for judgment if mankind turned against him, God can do that. And the physics don't say that he couldn't have. The physics are reinforcing the fact that this would be a stable construct for God to design the earth, not only with the water, but with the pillars, the foundations of the earth that were sunk into the bases over days 2 and 3. So these sediments, which is typical, right? Drive toward Grand Junction, Colorado, you see this stuff for hours. You drive anywhere outside of cities, well, you can't be in the plains really. You've got to be near the mountains. But you see this stuff all over the world. And so CPT can't explain the erosion of the rock, the sediments in those layers. It can't explain where it came from without appealing to miracles. I've mentioned supercritical water. That's when water gets hot enough and enough pressure, and it behaves very different than a solid, liquid, or gas. Well, at this conference, Stephen Austin said this, and I've been noticing this for 10 years. Our creation scientists, they make so much progress when they see what Walt Brown has been doing, and they say, oh yeah, let's try that. Stephen said, supercritical water is very friendly to the creationist view. We should all look for this and how it behaves at depth. Deep below the crust of the earth, supercritical water will help explain what happened during the flood. This is Walt Brown, 7 years earlier in his book, in the beginning on his website. During the flood, supercritical evaporated accelerated out of the chamber. This tremendous acceleration expanded the spacing between water molecules, allowing flash evaporation, sudden cooling, and erosion, and so on. So Walt has been on the cutting edge of the creation movement for 30 years. But it's because I think of the souring of the relationships early on, and then it's the not invented here syndrome. Okay, so that was the 4 miracles, and then we have the anti-miracle, which is maybe the saddest part of all. At the ICC, leaders of catastrophic plate tectonics two in particular were in front of a plenary session, and we reported this on our Real Science Radio show /ICC, easy to find. And they said that the moon had to be created before day 4. And that was tragic because the Bible couldn't be more explicit. They're young earth creationists, and they say we believe the earth is less than 10,000 years old, but the moon had to be created before day 4. And that is devastating. It's too much of a commitment to your model and insufficient commitment to the scriptures. They don't know what is the source of radioactivity. They admit that. So they don't know why is there radioactivity on the earth and the moon. And how would they correlate? And if you had all that radioactive decay, what happened to all the heat? They have so many unknowns, and to take all those unknowns and conclude this is not reasonable. And I was so proud of Danny Faulkner, the astronomer for AIG. He used to be the astronomer, well, for years at North Carolina State University, one of their professors in astronomy. He immediately responded. And he said, John, I feel like I need to rebuke you. This is in front of like 400 people. He said, because the Bible clearly states that God made the sun, the moon, and the stars on day 4, and we have been fighting theistic evolutionists and progressive creationists for decades, and they say, oh, God made the moon and the sun and the stars before day 4, but they just became visible then. And Danny said, this is not a commitment to our fundamental principles. But it's another example of how far we will go in service to a model, to our ideas. Last thing, I'm glad to use this photo because it communicates John to be as friendly as I know him to be. He said something that I wrote down when he said it at the conference. He said, Henry Morris visited the church I was attending many years ago to promote creation and the flood, and I decided to focus on problems in earth science. That's a great thing. And then he said, I had an epiphany. We must figure out how to fit plate tectonics into the Bible. That's a verbatim quote. That is not a safe approach for figuring out what does the Bible say and how might God have created the earth and how did the flood come about. It's not a model that raises confidence. And it's exactly what happened with the theistic evolutionists. Now, they were worse because on the face of it, theistic evolution undermines the authority of the Bible. Plate tectonics almost does the same thing because it happens over billions of years, but John said, but we speed it up 1,000,000-fold. So it's biblical. And they call it catastrophic plate tectonics. Is it really catastrophic in the biblical sense? You know, there's a flood. They said it was a flood of biblical proportion. Well, in the biblical sense, if CPT cannot erode the sediments for the flood, is it even catastrophic? It's not even catastrophic. It's not catastrophic in biblical terms. And scientifically, it's not catastrophic enough to cause the phenomenon of the flood. And I don't believe it even has a reasonable answer to where did the water come from. Just because the edges of the supercontinent start diving into the mantle, where does all the water come from? To bury the mountains. The water comes from under the crust. We've already discussed how in radioactive decay, there's an alpha particle, and that thing will cause birth defects. And that's all over the world today. Thankfully, if you look at the crust of the earth, the crust of the continents, that's where all the radioactivity is, mostly. But it's relatively rare, thankfully. But it is on the continents. And God didn't put it there. Atheists say the funniest things. We interviewed theoretical physicist, emphasis on the theoretical, Lawrence Krauss from ASU. He's best friends with Richard Dawkins. He wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing, and the Discovery Channel made a special out of it. So we created a little spot on our website, rsr.org/Watsa, Because when you talk to an atheist, evolutionist, and you use common terms, things that you could find around the house, you know, they say, what's that? What's that? What's that? If you say evidence, they say, what's evidence? If you say, well, isn't this a problem? They say, what's a problem? Isn't it anything you say? So we had this from Eugenie Scott and Michael Shermer and Aaron Ra. Richard Dawkins does this. That's probably where Krauss got it. But Krauss really took the prize, the record, for the most in the shortest amount of time. Krauss is an atheist, so here's what he said.
So the creationists who've been saying for decades that Neanderthals were people have been confirmed. DNA doesn't lie.
What do you mean people?
People. Human beings.
I mean, our DNA is within 97% the same as an amoeba.
So many atheists and evolutionists now saying that perhaps...
I don't know what you mean by atheists and evolutionists.
Some people are evolutionists, some people are
What do you
not.
mean by evolutionists?
People who believe molecules to man evolution.
Well, let's stop a second. I don't even use the word believe. Scientists don't use the word believe. I don't believe anything.
The best-selling atheist authors, to me, seem...
Well, they're all atheists, so it doesn't really matter. I don't know what you're talking about.
They're all atheists.
Essentially, the first
Like-
approximation all scientists are, yeah.
Now, are you open to the possibility that Darwinism is false?
What do you mean Darwinism?
That is the way it goes, talking to evolutionists, atheists, pro-aborts. That's what it's like. Because they're afraid of the discussion. That's called obfuscation. So with all that, there was one point where Lawrence Krauss agreed with me that radioactivity and granitic crust go together, like hand and glove, like peanut butter and jelly, like Peyton Manning and the Broncos. You know. I had to get that in there. I know. When you guys beat the Broncos, was that 3 weeks ago? Our favorite sign was somebody in the stands. It said, "We love you, Peyton, just not tonight." Okay, so he agreed with me on this point on radioactivity, which he's so disagreeable, and he's a leading theoretical physicist in the world. He might be in the top 10 maybe for popularity-wise. And so for him to agree is significant.
Study. So again, once again, you
all
don't
right,
even know what you're talking about.
on this, I think I know very much what I'm talking about. 90% of the Earth's radioactivity is in the crustal rock of the continents.
That's a true statement.
Okay. So, finally, right? So why is it there? If those heavy elements were formed in supernova, Larry Krauss blasphemes Jesus Christ when he says, "Forget Jesus, a star died so you could live." That's what he says.
So forget Jesus. The stars died so that you could be here today. Okay? And anyway, he's great.
Now, he's wrong even scientifically, because this year, the journal Nature has published that we now know that supernovas can't create the heavy elements. Everything heavier than iron, which means most of the elements, they can't make them in supernovas. There's not enough energy. There's not enough temperature. There's not enough pressure. There's not enough neutrons. And they look at the light. They're not making heavy elements like they thought. We've all been told that stars explode and they make all the elements that are in our bodies. Well, they can only make the elements up to iron. So why are all those elements here? Chemical evolution cannot answer where do the heavy elements come from. The National Academy of Sciences, which is America's most prestigious body of atheistic Darwinist scientists, they published the 11 greatest questions for physics just a few years ago. And question number 4 or 5 was, how did heavy elements form? They don't know. Wouldn't that be a shock to most people who watch the Discovery Channel and listen to Science Friday on NPR? They'd be shocked. They thought they figured it all out. Heat problems solved by miracles, that's the claim, right? Yeah, but after the flood, the earth wasn't just the right temperature, like a Goldilocks, just right temperature. It was way too cold. Glaciers, millions of square miles of frozen muck called loess or lurs. The Ice Age. If God was going to remove the problem of the heat, well then why did he remove so much heat? He could have done it just perfectly. So the Bible doesn't say God gave a flood and then he gave an ice age to really punish mankind. No, he gave a flood. The ice age was a result of the consequences of the flood. After the flood, the world wasn't too hot, but too cold. So look for a flood model with processes that systematically remove heat. The vapor canopy theory, it doesn't remove heat. Catastrophic plate tectonics, it creates a lot of heat with the accelerated decay. It doesn't remove heat. The hydroplate theory removes heat. The fusion of heavy elements, when lightning creates heavier elements, this has been done in the lab by scientists thousands of times. They produce electric currents that are like lightning bolts, tremendously finely focused on a micro dot. And the temperature gets so hot, you know, we talk about the sun, how hot that is. This gets, in the laboratory, 640 million degrees for like a millionth of a second. And it produces, out of normal elements like iron or gold or other elements, it produces uranium and thorium and polonium and radon and all the heavy elements. It produces all of them. They've been doing this thousands of times, and it's a stunning advance in nuclear physics to realize that when you have sufficient electrical current focused in a Z-pinch way, you create heavy elements. And not only do they create heavy elements, you know, in the earth, there's a certain amount of this element, a certain amount of that element. There's 60 heavier elements, heavier than iron or so. Well, they produce those elements in the lab by accident in about the same proportions that they exist in the crust of the earth. So that is just astounding evidence that those heavy radioactive elements came from the global flood and the electrical discharges in the crust during the flood. So fusion of heavier elements, oh, by the way, when that happens, the whole lab should melt down, you know. But they say the process is adiabatic. The process, it doesn't melt down the equipment, it absorbs heat. Because when you make a uranium atom from smaller atoms, because their electrons are stripped away and the nucleus are pushed, squeezed together so tightly, it overcomes the Coulomb force that wants to shoot like particles apart, protons. Like you have an atom, 2 protons, 2 neutrons. Why doesn't it fly apart? It wants to by the electromagnetic Coulomb force, but the strong force holds it together. And when the atom nucleus becomes too big, it's real heavy, like uranium, the nucleus is so big that the strong force can't hold on to all the protons and the neutrons. The Coulomb force then, because the distance is so great, they measure it in barns, the distance is so great that the strong force loses hold of some protons and neutrons and they shoot out. And that's why we have radioactivity. So in lightning and in this Proton 21 laboratory, they focus this electrical current on pieces of iron or whatever they use, and as long as it's relatively pure, and they produce all these heavy elements. And they call it cold repacking because it takes energy to make those heavy elements. So in a nuclear power plant with fission, we are generating a lot of heat. If you're using fusion and you're building heavier elements by smashing atoms together, you are absorbing heat. So you take all that radioactive decay that the rate team and CPT thinks they have a problem with, And most of it went into the creation of Earth's radioactivity. The heavy elements were made with that heat energy. There's more to the story, of course. Supercritical water expansion, converting energy, heat energy into kinetic energy by launching the fountains of the great deep through the atmosphere and the rocks and the water going out to become the comets and asteroids. That also removed a lot of heat. Kinetic conversion of heat to kinetic energy and supercritical water expansion jetting into space. Okay, last thing. Natural, God-made subterranean chamber. And we went to Istanbul, our Bible tour of Turkey, and we saw a man-made subterranean chamber called the Basilica Cistern. We thought, wow, that's a pretty good model for the subterranean chamber the way the Bible describes it. It doesn't look the same, but it has all the same parts. So I just wanted to show you where this is. In Istanbul, there's a church there, Hagia Sophia, and down here, 3 blocks away, is one of the largest mosques in the world, the Blue Mosque. We went in there. That mosque was built 400 years ago. The church was built 1,000 years before that. And Hagia Sophia is so enormous, you could put the Blue Mosque inside the church. That's how big it was. And it was built 1,000 years before. Since the Muslims took over Turkey, Ottoman Empire, so the Arabic signs, they put them up in the church. But they did leave the Christian mosaics. We use this on, in fact, we might have it on the table back there. Our Bible studies in the Gospels, we use this mosaic of Jesus from back then, from 1,400 years ago. But at the same time the church was built, there was the cistern that was dug under the streets of Istanbul. And this is a picture of it. This is not a church. This is an underground chamber to collect rainwater. We're going to look at this and just use it as a model of what we saw in the Bible about how God made the underground chamber. We have the pillars that the Bible speaks of, and they didn't look like thin columns like these, but we saw from Eric Donovan's animation approximately by physics what they would have looked like. And the beams of the upper chambers would be where the pillars are connected horizontally to the other pillars. In the upper chambers, each one would hold 100 billion gallons of water at the top of the subterranean chamber. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? And in the Hebrew, those bases sunk, it's the same Hebrew for when, like, Solomon built the temple in 1 Kings, and he put the columns, they had their capitals at the top, and at the bottom they had their bases. It's the same architectural terminology. We saw how it was a 2-day process, so literally the bases were sunk into the foundations. He established the earth upon its foundations so that it will not totter forever and ever. The earth is the Lord's. He has founded it upon the seas, established it upon the waters. The earth, I set up its pillars firmly. He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters. You who laid the foundations of the earth, you covered it with the deep. This clip is not an endorsement of the upcoming film from Paramount, but it might help us to envision the mechanism that the Bible describes with the primary mechanism of the flood, as Henry Morris points out in the Genesis record, which is not rain falling down, but the fountain shooting up.
Beginning of everything.
Did you see the glimpse of that mountain in the background when the ark was in the waters? Well, if the water came from up above, then that's it. The rain stops. You're not going to cover those mountains. But the water prevailed for 150 days. It kept rising after the rain stopped. That tells us that the vast majority of the water came from below, not from above. By the way, while that's an idea of what the flood was like, very likely that Hollywood may include sexually seductive scenes. So it'd be wrong to see any movie that has those kinds of scenes, but we do use, at our family, clear play technology. You buy a DVD player and it takes out objectionable, it takes out profanity, and it takes out sexually immoral scenes. So we like it. The hydroplate theory answers all these mysteries about the Earth, the way it is, and the solar system. If the vapor canopy is true, what it does is tells us where the water came from, and maybe it tells us why animals grew bigger and trees, but things grow bigger when they live longer, and the genetics were different, and there was no radioactivity before the flood, which has really hurt every living creature on Earth. But CPT and vapor canopy, they don't answer the serious questions about why is the world the way it is. Try to Google this. This is for our own Real Science radio program. It's not as good as Walt Brown, but if you Google Young Earth, 750,000 pages, our website is number 2. We're beat only by Wikipedia. And that includes beating all the major creation ministries. So we wouldn't mind if they beat us, because they have way more resources. We just are happy that, we're doing well. Dinosaur soft tissue, we are number 2 of 169,000 pages. Should Christians judge? You can do it without quotes, and we're also very high. But in quotes gives you more accurate. Should Christians judge? We're number 2 out of 14 million pages. So we're pretty unhappy with that. Now, we're pretty thrilled, but number 1 would be good. Why was Canaan cursed? It's surprising how many people Google that. 1 of 800,000 pages. And finally, what does the Bible say about abortion? Number 15, that's not too great, but of 2.2 million pages. And that article is at AmericanRightToLife.org. That's the global flood and hydroplate theory. I want to thank you very much for my co-host, Fred Williams, and for myself, Bob Enyart. God bless you guys.
Intelligent design and DNA. Scholars can't explain it all away. Get ready to be awed by the handiwork of God. Tune into Real Science Radio. Turn up the Real Science Radio. Keeping it real. That's what I'm talking about.
We are commonly taught that the Earth is made of stardust, leftover star material that was expelled from a supernova. This assumption gave rise to the idea that radioactive decay of certain elements created by these stars, another big assumption, could be used to measure the age of the Earth. Earth's radioactivity is often cited as the reason why Earth has not completely solidified over billions of years, and why there is much geothermal heat coming up from below. While that may seem a satisfactory explanation for these issues, there is much contradictory evidence. In fact, the lightning we see during a storm gives some clues to the remarkable origin of radioactivity on Earth. The hydroplate theory will show further that the root cause behind this radioactivity is uniquely explained by the extraordinary conditions produced by a global flood. The theory of chemical evolution claims that the Big Bang occurred 13 to 14 billion years ago. Conditions were so severe that this initial event only produced the lightest 3 elements of the 94 found in nature: hydrogen, helium, and lithium. Chemical evolution theory maintains that the remaining elements were cooked in stars and ultimately produced and spread throughout the universe when the stars ran out of fuel and exploded as supernova. It is assumed that our solar system, including the Earth and the radioactive elements found on the Earth, gravitationally accreted from the debris of this explosion. Heat generated by the many impacts of this accretion supposedly resulted in a molten Earth for approximately 200 million years. After 200 million years, accretion ceased, so the liquid cooled and the heat was radiated into space, forming a crust. The radioactive parent elements trapped in and on the Earth then decayed into daughter elements we find today. Today, the ratio of the number of parent to daughter atoms is measured, and the decay half-life is then factored in to arrive at a radiometric date for any given rock sample on Earth. This assumption about the past is the foundational rationale for old Earth theories. Many leading evolutionists assert confidently that the Earth and everything in it came about from stars exploding. Some realize that all the physics hasn't been worked out to back up this claim. Another problem with this idea is that much evidence collected from similar nearby rocky planets like Venus and Mars suggests that they have very cold cores and/or show little radioactive decay. This is odd, assuming that all planets formed from the same stardust. Earth's core is hot while its crust contains much radioactivity. Conditions on Earth are very different. Binding energy is what holds an atom's nucleus and all its positively charged protons together. The binding energy per nucleon, that is either proton or neutron, changes depending on how many protons and neutrons the chemical element has. Here we see a chart of the average binding energy per nucleon for each element. The elements are shown on the x-axis by the number of nucleons they have, and the y-axis shows the average binding energy per nucleon for every given element. Light elements are on the left and heavier elements are on the right. Notice there is a peak in this data at around 60 nucleons. The binding energy per nucleon is as high as it can be, and anything heavier sees a drop in energy, holding nucleons together. The evolutionary explanation might work for nuclei with less than 60 nucleons. This is because fission events for light elements result in increased binding energy. For example, if two deuterium nuclei fused into one helium-4 nucleus, you can see that the binding energy per nucleon increases, meaning the new helium nucleus is held together more securely than the two deuterium nuclei. If the data kept climbing up and to the right, all would be well for the chemical evolution theory. As you can see, this is not the case for elements heavier than 60 nucleons. Trying to merge any of these heavy nuclei in the chaos of a supernova will always result in less binding energy, and they will break up or fission. The larger the nucleus, the greater this tendency, as there is less and less binding energy holding it together. This is the data that causes chemical evolutionists to look to physicists in hope that they will eventually figure out why cosmological theory doesn't match observation. This is also why the United States National Research Council in the year 2000 listed the following as one of the 11 greatest unanswered questions in physics, and that is, how were the heavy chemical elements from iron to uranium made? Textbooks and teachers rarely explain this problem. Here is why we see a peak in the data at around 60 nucleons. If you think about it, like charges repel, so an atom's nucleus should fly apart because of this Coulomb force. Any nucleus with two positive protons should fly apart due to the Coulomb force. Of course, this does not occur because the strong nuclear force takes over at extremely short distances. Think of the strong force as a powerful magnet with very short range. If protons get close enough, the strong force will slam them together in spite of the Coulomb force. Understanding this relationship between Coulomb and strong nuclear forces is key to understanding why heavy elements become increasingly unstable and tend to fission no matter how big and powerful a supernova is. Even the tremendous kinetic energy inside a star cannot overcome this Coulomb force for heavy elements. As we can see, a nucleus with 60 or more protons and neutrons has a diameter so big that not all the protons are within one another's strong nuclear force field of attraction. So the Coulomb force tries to push these outer protons apart. Impacting particles during a supernova would only tend to aid the Coulomb force in breaking apart the nucleus. Instability of large nuclei lead to decay. The larger the nucleus, the more unstable it is. This is why heavy elements, like uranium, are radioactive. We will discuss several types of decay. Of course, fission is when a nucleus breaks apart. The resulting fragments will reform into any number of smaller elements and isotopes. Beta decay occurs when a neutron in the nucleus becomes a proton and an electron is expelled. The electron is called a beta particle. Alpha decay occurs when a tight bundle of two protons and two neutrons are ejected from a nucleus. The alpha particle is a helium nucleus. Much is made of the extremely old dates that radioactive dating supposedly shows. However, alpha particles produced during decay are rarely discussed, because as we'll see, they tell a much different story about the history and age of the Earth. Zircons are durable minerals that contain uranium. The uranium that has decayed in the zircons indicates they are 1.5 billion years old. However, the helium produced by the uranium's alpha decays gives a much different picture. Think of a zircon as a leaking helium balloon. If 1.5 billion years of time has gone by, then the balloon should be empty. However, measurements of the rate of helium loss in zircons indicate they remain astoundingly full, with data showing only 4,000 to 8,000 years of helium loss. If a supernova did not cause nucleosynthesis of heavy elements, what did? Where is Earth's radioactivity located? Looking first at an evolutionary model and following well-established laws of heat transfer, we'd conclude that after billions of years of radioactive decay and assumed mantle crust circulation or convection, that the heat produced should uniformly be distributed throughout the Earth's crust and mantle. This idea, however, is not supported by the data. Measurements all over the world show striking differences in the distribution of heat. While radioactivity produces heat, it is not safe to assume that lots of heat means radioactivity is the source. For example, the ocean floors are releasing a great deal of heat, however little radioactivity exists there. In startling contrast, Earth's continents are releasing slightly less heat than ocean floors, yet we find 70 times more radioactivity concentrated on our continents. In addition, radioactive heating on the continents is spotty and not uniform. Interestingly, the ratio of deuterium or heavy hydrogen to normal hydrogen in Earth's oceans is only half that found in comets. Deuterium is created when hydrogen atoms in water molecules are bombarded by neutrons. If Earth's water came from comets, why do our oceans have only half the deuterium concentration as comets? What produced the deuterium? Why is there a difference in the ratios? Many believe that nuclear reactions are occurring deep inside the Earth's core, and that the heat released by these reactions is the cause of geothermal heat. Measurements taken in the world's deepest drill holes show that temperatures rise very rapidly with depth. If deep radioactivity from Earth's core is the source of this heat, then the temperature increase with depth would mean everything below 50 miles is melted. However, seismic data from thousands of earthquakes show conclusively that the mantle rock is solid down to about 1,800 miles depth. Karl's law and Jaeger reveal that while the distribution of radioactive elements in Earth is unknown, the radioactivity must be shallow, not deep, and confined to the Earth's thin granite crust. This means the radioactivity is concentrated in the primarily granitic continental materials. So to answer this first question, Earth's radioactivity is not uniformly distributed throughout Earth as is expected if Earth evolved. Instead, we see that radioactive elements are concentrated in the Earth's granite continental crust. The hydroplate theory will explain why. We now must answer a second question in order to see how heavy elements were created. What conditions or forces could overcome the Coulomb force? Two possibilities exist. They are the Z-pinch and shock collapse. Returning to the bolt of lightning, let's discuss what it is. Atmospheric lightning is a plasma. A plasma occurs upon electrical breakdown of any substance. In this case, the air molecules, mostly nitrogen and oxygen, have been transformed from their normal gaseous state into a plasma. This happens as the electrical potential or voltage between the clouds and the ground increases above the air's dielectric strength. The result is a massive flow of electrons, or a current, that arcs between the cloud to the ground. After a lightning strike, showers of gamma rays and a burst of neutrons are detected, a result of nuclear reactions and radioactive elements produced by the lightning. So what is happening within the plasma? When electrical current travels through close parallel wires, a very powerful pinching force is generated known as a Z-pinch. Lightning struck this tube, causing it to be radially compressed or pinched together. The higher the voltage and closer the wires, the stronger the pinch. In lightning at electrical breakdown of air, the plasma produced as electrons are stripped from the air's nitrogen and oxygen molecules act like closely spaced wires carrying tremendous flow or current of electrons. The stripped electrons follow paths that resemble the flow of electrons in closely spaced wires, but the spacing is at a minuscule atomic scale. Remember, the closer the spacing, the stronger the pinching force. Since the atom's outer electrons are stripped away, the positively charged nuclei, rather than flying apart, are powerfully pinched together. The pinch is so strong that it overcomes the Coulomb force, and the strong nuclear force snaps the nuclei together, forming heavy, unstable, radioactive nuclei with short half-lives between 10 and 100 minutes. Of course, this all occurs in an instant, producing light we see as a bolt and an intense heat that expands surrounding air, producing the sonic crack of thunder. This effect is similar to the research that Germany's Dr. Fritz Bosch has demonstrated. An intense electrical field will strip electrons from surrounding nuclei. The atoms become unstable and throw themselves apart, sometimes changing their decay half-life a billionfold. The term Z-pinch is used because those first studying this phenomenon were using the familiar XYZ Cartesian coordinate system in their analysis, and the compressive pinching force was occurring about the Z-axis. Had they set up the force diagram on a different axis, we may be talking about the X or the Y pinch. This is not science fiction or theory. Researchers at Sandia National Laboratories have built this Z-pinch machine and are taking advantage of this powerful force to produce nuclear fusion in an effort to produce a controlled nuclear fusion reactor. Nuclear power plants today are fission reactors. If successful, a fusion reactor would be able to produce great amounts of cheap, clean electrical energy. The Ukraine's Electrodynamics Proton 21 lab has been revealing the tremendous power of the electrical Z-pinch. While stars can only produce the first 26 or so elements, researchers are finding that a focused Z-pinch can produce the entire periodic table of elements and far beyond. Researchers at this laboratory using the Z-pinch can squeeze together a target of pure common nuclei like gold, silver, and lead into previously unknown super heavy elements, many twice as heavy as uranium or lead. These super heavy elements, because they are so large, are unstable and quickly decay back into the more stable 94 natural elements. The process involves passing a beam of electrons traveling near the speed of light into a target electrode of extremely pure metal to produce a focused Z-pinch, which implodes the target's nuclei into a tiny point. Because the point is so small, temperatures in the hot dot reach a staggering 630 million degrees Fahrenheit. The imploding nuclei within the hot dot merge into unstable superheavy nuclei. The hot dot then explodes, producing a flash of light, gamma rays, X-rays, and many nuclei fragments of all sizes that repack into the more stable 94 or so naturally occurring elements and isotopes, plus some superheavy elements that last for several months before decaying. Incidentally, the stable elements that are produced and are heavier than 60 nucleons end up absorbing the excess heat. Thus, the hydroplate theory solves the problem that has perplexed others. How could Earth have withstood the heat released by so much accelerated decay? The answer is simple. The heat was absorbed in fusing heavy elements such as uranium. This has been demonstrated by the Proton 21 laboratory. Dr. Adamanko calls it cold repacking. So far, 22 different metals have been used for electrodes. All produce similar results. After subjection to the Z-pinch, a portion of the pure material is transformed into lesser amounts of all the naturally occurring elements. Why does this happen? Why do these super heavy elements decay and fragment into the 94 naturally occurring, relatively stable elements, including some heavy, slightly unstable radioactive elements that are concentrated in Earth's primarily granitic continents? To understand, we need to see what drives instability. Here we see the periodic table with elements color-coded according to their instability. As has been discussed, the larger the nucleus, the greater its potential instability. This instability is not only due to size, but also the ratio of the atom's protons to neutrons. For most light elements that are stable, this ratio of protons to neutrons is high at around 1, close to 50% protons to 50% neutrons. For very heavy elements to remain somewhat stable, this proton-to-neutron ratio drops to around 0.67, or roughly 40% protons to 60% neutrons. Remember this difference between these two groups of elements. Now consider what happens when a Z-pinch of many small, light nuclei produces a large super-heavy nucleus. Since the large nucleus has been made up of merged lighter nuclei, whose proton-to-neutron ratios are 50-50, the new super-heavy nucleus will retain the same 50-50 ratio, and therefore it is extremely unstable. When all the elements and their many isotopes are plotted according to their proton-to-neutron ratios and then given an instability rating, the pictured chart is produced. What we see is that if you have too many protons or too many neutrons in the nucleus is extremely unstable, shown here as 100% unstable, and it will immediately break up or decay. Stable elements that we are familiar with are located down in what is termed the valley of stability. Notice the valley of stability curves to the right between points A and C. The 50-50 proton-to-neutron ratio line is shown between points A and B. Viewed from directly above, we can now see the bottom of the valley of stability. We see uranium-238 is somewhat stable, with a half-life of 4.5 billion years, and it plots on one of the side walls of the valley. Uranium-238 decays into lead-206, which is stable at the very bottom of the valley. One of the decay products, while U-238 decays toward lead-206, is polonium-218. We see that it is very unstable and that it plots along the high rim of the neutron-heavy plateau of instability. Polonium-218 has a half-life of only 3 minutes. Here is the 50-50 ratio line again. Remember, lighter elements have proton-to-neutron ratios near the 50-50 line. If Z-pinched together, these light elements form heavier elements with the same 50-50 ratio. They lie high on the proton-heavy side of the plateau and quickly fission into many smaller fragments, some of which are still radioactive and unstable, like uranium, polonium, etc. We now begin to see why many question the validity of assuming uranium-238 to lead-206 and all other parent-daughter decay ratios represent the age of a rock sample. So what does this have to do with the flood or the age of the Earth? If powerful electrical events that were a consequence of a global flood produced radioactive elements, then many mysteries of Earth's radioactivity can be explained, and radiometric dates are meaningless. For evolutionary theory, the alleged mountain of data in support of great uniformitarian epochs of time really only adds up to nothing more than a very precise series of ratios, not a date. But how does hydroplate theory tie Earth's radioactivity to a recent global flood? The key to seeing how Earth's radioactivity is concentrated in Earth's continental crust is to recognize that the main rock found is granite. Unlike basalt that covers the ocean floors, granite contains a great deal of the mineral quartz, up to 27% quartz. Quartz crystals are arranged in such a way that they will produce an electrical potential, or voltage, if they are stretched or compressed. Such materials are said to be piezoelectric. Piezo means pressure. Ever wonder how your gas grill can light the propane by simply pushing a button that has no battery? The snap you hear at the end of the button stroke is a spring slamming into a quartz crystal, causing it to compress and give off a spark, igniting the gas. Here is a device that allows us to see what is happening without tearing apart your grill. A child could push or pull on the lever and produce enough pressure in the small quartz pellet to produce a 4,000-volt spark. Imagine the voltage produced on a continental scale instead of this desktop display. Some may ask, what evidence is there that granite could produce electrical charges? Here are some quotes taken from eyewitnesses around the world. Many scientists have begun to think the root cause of these accounts as being due to the piezoelectric materials in granite being stressed during an earthquake. Hydroplate theory shows that during the flood, the granite continents were exposed to more extreme cyclic pressures on a much larger scale. Hydroplate theory poses that during the beginning stages of the flood, as supercritical water rocketed out from under the fractured plates, water flowing under the plates in combination with seismic waves sent through the plates due to buckling failure of the plates supporting pillars induced flutter in the granite plates. So what is flutter? Whenever a fluid flows over a flexible surface, a vibration or flutter can be induced. This is easily seen in a flag that is flapping in a strong wind. Flutter is a phenomena that must be considered in designing aircraft structures like wings to prevent their fatigue. So what evidence is there that the Earth's massive granite continents once fluttered? Lineaments are very long parallel fractures that have been observed in the surface of Earth's continents. Some unique properties of lineaments are that the material on either side has not been displaced and does not change in elevation. We can postulate several failure mechanisms for these features. However, only one is consistent with observation. Looking at compression, we see that compressive failure from crushing or impacts would not produce long, thin cracks, but many randomly directed fractures and displacements. The continent could have sheared, but the shearing would have produced displacements. Horizontal tension may be an option, but horizontal tension would pull a slab of rock apart at the single point of failure and not produce multiple parallel fractures that we see in lineaments. Finally, consider tension and bending. This mode will produce multiple parallel fractures in a material. Rather than displacing, they will simply close back together once the bending load is removed. Of these failure modes, lineaments seem most likely to be tension cracks formed due to bending at some point in Earth's history. Here is how the lineaments form due to flutter. The wave that flutter produces causes a structure to bend back and forth as it flexes. This flexing produced long undisplaced parallel fractures that we see today as lineaments. Think of a simple two-dimensional beam loaded as shown. Notice the parallel red lines at the ends of the beam. The loads will cause the beam to deflect into an arc. The convex side is in tension as the material stretches past the red lines. The neutral axis of the beam in the middle is neither in tension or compression. The concave side is in compression as the material is squeezed between the red lines. While granite has excellent compression strength, its tensile strength is very weak. This property of granite combined with the bending from flutter during the flood produced the lineaments we see today. During the flood, continental hydroplates began to flutter as an ocean of water flowed under and burst out of the crack. Piezoelectric quartz fills these granite plates, which were exposed to cyclic tension and compression that produced the huge voltages throughout the granite. Just as the dielectric strength of air breaks down in an electric storm, granite's dielectric strength was exceeded, resulting in powerful electrical surges or plasma arcing within the fluttering plates. Each time the supporting pillars were lifted and then slammed down into the mantle floor, tremendous compressive pressures crushed the pillars. Like the Proton 21 lab experiments, self-focused Z-pinches occurred at microscopic points within the pillars. The high temperatures on the order of 630 million degrees Fahrenheit at each point was enough to melt a millimeter or two of surrounding rock, creating small chondral spheres. Some of these fragments were launched into space and fall back to the Earth as meteorites today. A bit later we'll discuss how these tremendous velocities were achieved. As discussed, the arcing lightning or plasma strips nearby elements of their orbiting electrons. In this case, the elements involved in the Z-pinch were those that comprise granite rather than air. The elements that make up granite were vaporized into a plasma state stripped of their electrons, setting up the conditions for the Z-pinches to occur. Next we'll see a second mechanism that could have aided in heavy nucleus building. Lightning in the deep granite led to further nuclear fusion via shock collapse events. As rock became plasma along the thin pathways of the electrical discharge, the shock wave generated by the electrical heating suddenly expanded the plasma and surrounding rock walls. With air, the shock wave causes thunder. However, the deep granite was not able to expand like air. Instead, the surrounding walls momentarily expanded by the shock wave, then rebounded like a giant compressed spring from all directions. The rock collapsed back into the plasma with enough shock energy to fuse nuclei together at various places along the plasma paths. This happened frequently deep in the crust where the rock was already highly compressed. As can be seen, light nuclei that make up granite, like silicon, oxygen, magnesium, iron, aluminum, fluorine, calcium, potassium, and sodium, were Z-pinched and fused into super heavy, highly unstable elements, which then fissioned rapidly and randomly produced many new elements and their isotopes. This essentially lined the Valley of Stability and its walls with all kinds of isotope combinations produced. Many of these were heavier than iron and or radioactive like potassium, rubidium, strontium, uranium, thorium, polonium, radon, etc., the ratios of which are incorrectly relied upon today as absolute clocks for determining age. In addition to producing all kinds of new, heavy, unstable elements, another series of chain reactions would have occurred at the nuclear level within the granite plates. These reactions transferred much of the generated heat into the subterranean water. In addition, they caused accelerated radioactive decay of newly created isotopes and heavy elements. This massive electrical plasma storm surged within the granite and produced a sea of flowing accelerated electrons which passed close by, surrounding granite nuclei and any newly formed elements. This decelerated or accelerated the high-speed electrons, producing secondary Bremsstrahlung radiation. The result was the release of a photon. Bremsstrahlung is a German term for radiation produced by either decelerating or accelerating an electron. These high-energy photon showers were accelerated and decelerated by the surrounding nuclei, which in turn produced a sea of free neutrons. Many of the nuclei affected by these electron, photon, and neutron showers were newly formed fission fragments of unstable, radioactive heavy elements. In this unique and turbulent environment, these nuclei experienced accelerated radioactive decay rates that were orders of magnitude faster than the decay rates measured today. Missing the evidence of this catastrophic event gives many the false impression that eons of time have passed by because of the ratios that they measure. However, we can see that this new theory of events shows that these ratios have nothing to do with age. In the lower levels of the plates, where for centuries prior to the flood supercritical water had eaten innumerable porous channels up into the granite, the surging sea of free neutrons released in the granite were thermalized, that is, slowed down by the subterranean supercritical water. As a result, nuclear energy was transferred from the granite into the subterranean waters that were escaping to the surface and beyond. Some have scoffed at Walt's theory of nucleosynthesis occurring in the granite, citing that the heat buildup from fission of these super-heavy elements would have vaporized the entire crust. From this they conclude the theory is invalid. However, they have overlooked or ignored important details of the process. So let's discuss this alleged problem of too much heat. Remember this binding energy chart. For elements lighter than 60, fusion results in higher binding energy, which does emit heat. However, fusion of nuclei heavier than 60 causes a drop in binding energy, which means the event absorbs heat from its surroundings. This is why the Proton 21 lab reports that the process produces a cold repacking of materials, and that the overall process, in spite of many secondary fission events, remains nearly adiabatic, meaning little heat is transferred to the surroundings. So while we'd expect the crust to see some heating, it certainly would not have completely vaporized or melted as some mistakenly conclude. So how was excess heat removed from the crust? Anyone who deals with heat transfer knows the purpose of these strange-looking fin features seen on engines. Friction and burning fuel creates heat that can destroy an engine. By increasing the external surface area of the engine block, more heat can be transferred to the cooler air, preventing the destruction of the engine. Instead of fins, when extremely efficient heat transfer is required, designers will use specialty products like porous aluminum foam to rapidly transfer heat to or from fluids. If supercritical water had not dissolved thin channels in the lower depths of the granite crust, the small surface area of the crust would have resulted in rapid heat buildup within. However, the porous channels function much like fins or aluminum foam on an engine, and greatly increase the effective surface area within the lower crust. Therefore, large amounts of heat generated by the nuclear level reactions within the crust was transferred quickly into the supercritical water below. We'll now examine the effect this heat transfer had on the supercritical water and soon see the results. Let's look at the molecular level to see what happened to the supercritical water that filled the porous granite. Some fast neutrons released by Bremsstrahlung radiation thermalized in the porous channels full of supercritical water, thus transferring energy and producing much deuterium and oxygen-18 in the supercritical water. Energy transfer into the supercritical water caused simultaneous evaporation of the fluid's liquid droplets into vapor. Evaporated gas expanded the fluid, which pretty much had nowhere to go but down, so this greatly pressurized the escaping subterranean waters below the crust. The supercritical water, as well as any dissolved minerals and fragments of crushed pillars, were accelerated by this continuing pressure all along the flow. This material was then launched and continued to accelerate high above the atmosphere. Some of it achieved high enough velocity to escape Earth's gravitational sphere of influence. The constant tumbling in the turbulent flow and sudden ejection into near absolute zero temperatures of space kept newly formed chondrules in the pillar fragments spherical, and the rapid freezing trapped many volatiles inside. Today, some of these strange rocks fall back to Earth as meteorites. Astronomers are mystified by chondrules. For example, what could have simultaneously melted so many tiny points within rock drifting in supercold absolute zero outer space? More and more astronomers are concluding that lightning must have somehow been present in outer space to concentrate enough heat to melt the tiny points of rock that later became parts of meteorites. Lightning is a plausible explanation for chondrules, but it is better explained as having originated in a piezoelectric storm from the quartz inside the granite crust of Earth, not outer space. The longer a flow is accelerated, the more speed it picks up. With bullets, even bullets with the same powder charge, bullet velocity can always be increased by simply lengthening the barrel as long as the gunpowder continues to burn all along the barrel and provide pressure. Imagine the effect of continuous expansion of the supercritical water all along the underside of the continent-sized plates, up through the 10-mile-high crack between the plates, and high above the atmosphere. Unlike a bullet which is no longer pushed by the gases outside of the barrel, the pressurized flow and anything in it would be continuously accelerated for hundreds, even thousands of miles, because every unit volume of supercritical water was expanded as its pressure was dropping all along the flow. In addition, the drop in pressure, once the fluid was out from under the plates, caused the supercritical water's many ions to snap back together. This immense electrical energy released in the supercritical flow caused violent expansion and acceleration. In some cases, the velocities of the flow were high enough to launch some materials beyond Earth's gravitational sphere of influence. Of course, pressurizing the waters below created the equal and opposite reaction of pushing up on the granite plates. In some places within the continental plates, it appears that this pressure was too much for the plate to structurally support. Many large inland seas appear as deep craters. Hydroplate theory ties these features again to the unique conditions seen during the Genesis flood. Some spots of the granite plates generated more nuclear energy than the surrounding area. If too much heat were generated in this local area, the pressure from the expanding supercritical water below could lead to catastrophic rupture of the plate. The newly exposed chamber floor rose up until it reached hydrostatic equilibrium and became the basin of an inland sea. The floors of these inland seas usually have thick mineral layers of salt. These layers are the remnants of the granite minerals dissolved by supercritical water of the Great Deep, and later precipitated by the process called outsalting that occurs in supercritical water. This was occurring decades before the Genesis flood. Because of the many neutrons absorbed by the supercritical water, we now find high concentrations of the isotope oxygen-18 in these deposits that blanket the Gulf of Mexico and the Mediterranean Sea. Finally, we can now see why comets are found to contain about 2 times more deuterium than today's oceans. The volume of the Great Deep was about half the volume of today's oceans. A relatively small amount of water was launched and escaped Earth's gravitation. This remains deuterium-rich in space. Some of the launched water radiated any remaining heat into space and fell back as constant rain for 40 days according to Genesis. Most of the remaining subterranean water continued to well up from under the plates for 110 days after the constant rain ceased. These deuterium-rich waters mixed with the pre-flood seas, which cut the concentration of deuterium in half. This is why we measure diluted concentrations of deuterium in our oceans today, and concentrated deuterium levels in comets. This presentation gives an overview of Walt Brown's online chapter on radioactivity's origin. I'd like to thank Dr. Brown for his input and review of this presentation. The radioactivity chapter, as well as additional information about the hydroplate theory and the many evidences that support the biblical account of a global flood, may be found at the Center for Scientific Creation website shown here.